Am I registering all right on the future here?
I don't know.
Okay, nothing must be lost. I don't know when anybody's going to have any time to listen to all the things that are being recorded in the present. They'll be wasting their lives doing it. My name is Kenneth Koch, and I'm sorry I was late, and I'm sorry we had to change rooms. It seemed very gloomy and dark and hot down there and scattered. I like the idea of these classes at Naropa, but I don't exactly know what I'm going to say because I didn't know who'd be in the room and I didn't know what you'd be interested in. Also, I believe it's impossible to teach anybody anything in a 2-hour lecture or even in 4 hours. One can excite people, confirm an idea they've already had, give them the idea to go on and do something else. But as far as really teaching somebody anything about writing or reading literature, I think it takes longer. Therefore, it didn't seem to make any sense to bring any texts and to teach them, or even to have you write a lot, though I'm going to have you write a little bit. It's also a lot easier to teach than it is to lecture, and it's much more satisfying. Lecturing is rather peculiar. I mean, all of this is supposed to be a class. It's kind of a lecture because I don't know you, and we'll spend very little time together. I wonder if there's some way I could find out who you all are. How many of you are at Naropa for the first time this summer, if you don't mind telling me? And how many of you altogether are full-time students somewhere? Very few. How many of you are write poetry? All of you. No, if you know. Let's see. What do I know now that I didn't know? How many of you? How many of you have studied at Naropa last year as well as the summer? That would give me a couple, 3. See, when I started to teach writing, which I did rather early on, when I was in my early 30s, I think, it was immensely enjoyable to me, and I really had a feeling I was accomplishing something, because the other people who were teaching writing, I thought, were doing it very badly. The poetry that I wrote, and the poetry that Frank O'Hara wrote, and that John Ashbery wrote, we were all friends and influenced each other a lot. This poetry was completely unknown to almost everybody except about 12 people, maybe 15. Nobody even recognized that what we were doing was really poetry at all. And it was a great pleasure to reveal to people whether or not they had yet been prejudiced by, ruined by, infected by the going academic idea of poetry at that time. I'm talking about the early 50s, early to middle 50s. Is that right? No, it's not 1950. Let's see. How old am I? The late 50s. The general idea of a poem at the time I started teaching writing, which was in the late 50s, 1960, the general idea was that a poem was something in quatrains, and it rhymed, and it was full of strict wit. You can get an idea of it from reading copies of the Partisan Review or the Sewanee Review or the Kenyon Review or the Hudson Review from those years. All the great experimentation that had taken place in American poetry before, during, and after World War I, that was all over. The general idea was that the people who edited magazines and anthologies and were sort of the bosses of the poetry world was that it was wonderful what Pound and Williams and Stevens and so on had done, but now was the time to get serious and to really make structures that worked, to really write what it really was some kind of, one can call it academic poetry, or one could call it, as I said in my poem, fresh air, the poetry written by the men with their eyes on the myth, the misses, and the midterms, since those seem to be the subjects of at least the poems of the younger poets who are in that awful anthology called, which you probably haven't ever seen, because it died to deserve a death, New Poets of England and America, edited by Donald Hall and Louis Simpson. You should look it up. everybody was writing these very safe quatrains about, getting married or separating, or what it was like to teach in a university in Iowa or Illinois or something. In any case, nobody seemingly had really read and been influenced by the French poets between the wars. Nobody seemed to really have been influenced by Walt Whitman in any radical kind of way. Walt Whitman, I think, seemed kind of unhealthy and sloppy. Nobody ever seemed to go to the ballet or ever seemed to go to opera. Nobody seemed to know much about painting. In other words, people were, there was just, I'm generalizing, of course, and this was all in my little prejudiced head. It just seemed to me from the poetry that got published that it was very narrow, and it was all written by people who were just thinking about what other people said about what other people said about what other people said. And so it was a great pleasure to come into a class, like if I had come into this class 20 years ago, 15 years ago, I'd have said, why don't you, I'd have had you all write a little stream of consciousness, or I'd have made you all buy a book of William Carlos Williams and read him and write 3 poems imitating his style. I'd have told you to go home and dream, and to write a poem about your dream, and also to write a prose account of your dream. And then I'd have discovered that the prose accounts were better poems than the poems, because in the poems you'd have interpreted the dreams and put them in quatrains and generalized them. In the prose accounts, you'd have actually written about the details. There'd still be a hole in the screen on the porch in the summer house, whereas in the poem it would have turned into the dark mystery of the summer or something. But you've all probably read William Carlos Williams. You've all probably written whatever comes into your head, and you've all probably used whatever it is that's not in your mind now, unless you're out of your mind, you're unconscious, in your poetry. So you don't need any of that. It was very enjoyable to help people to write when I started, because I could free them. All these people came into my poetry workshop at the New School. That's where I started to teach, about 1960. It was an adult workshop, and they were all playing about three keys on the piano, you know, and I wanted to show them there was a whole keyboard. In general, the girls were writing quatrains about lost love, and the guys were writing free verse poems about how terrible America was. They wanted to go on doing this, and they wanted me to help them get published. And I didn't want to do this because I knew I could make them much happier by having them write other things, like having them write sestinas, having them write poems with one word in every line, having them do translations, having them write poems that made no sense, having them write bad poems. And that was one of the most successful assignments I ever gave. If I had a week or two with you, it's certainly an assignment I'd still give you, because that's always a good one. The idea is you tell somebody to write the worst poem you can possibly write. Just absolutely worst. And there's a prize given at the New School called, it used to be the Dylan Thomas Poetry Award, and it was given for the best poem written in any writing class. And one of my students won it with his bad poem. It was really a good poem, and it was very sensuous and sexy and really nice, romantic poem. It was really good. And this guy had always written terribly dry things, sort of like the clipped edge of the board now. And this poem was terrific. Sally, all this stuff. Anyway, it was very nice. So I said, didn't you realize at a certain point this poem was good? And he said, yeah, about halfway through it began to seem kind of good. See, the reason that writing a bad poem can be inspiring is that it completely gets you away from what you think you have to do. Like, I'm real good at writing clipped poems. Well, there's nobody in the world who wants a clipped poem that I know of, and maybe that's not really what you're good at. Sometimes it's the kind of thing that turns one ideas upside down and allows one to try something one hasn't tried before. In any case, this whole process of freeing people from academic constraints seems to me fairly unnecessary at Naropa, where people have probably been overfreed. No, you can't really be overfreed, but you can go on being freed after there's no more need for it. And one wonders then what to do. Certainly in a couple of hours I can't. Oh, I could probably. I could teach you how to write a tavarima. I really could. But it might take 2 weeks, though. That is an iambic pentameter stanza which rhymes A, B, A, B, A, B, C, C, like Byron used in Don Juan. But the utility of that I don't quite know, except it would enable you to see that you could do it. You could imitate Byron, and then you'd like Byron more. However, I still think I don't know, I was trying to think what I would like to, the kind of things that poets said that I like to hear. One of the main things was I was just amazed to see anybody dressed up in regular clothes who was allowed to appear in a public place and who was a poet. But that was back in the 50s when it was practically a crime to be a poet, which it's not really anymore, and you're used to having poets around here. I remember Archibald MacLeish, whose poetry I don't like particularly, came to the University of Cincinnati when I was 18 years old, and every word he said seemed so wonderful to me because he was standing right up there with all these regular people and talking about poetry, this peculiar thing that was sort of a secret between me and my typewriter. And but you've all had a lot of that. So I thought maybe this is in keeping with Naropa. I guess it'd be very zen if I went on for 2 hours and just told you what I was not going to do. However, that might not be the absolutely best thing to do. I had a couple of ideas. As I said before, I don't think one can really teach anybody anything in a short time. So I thought maybe I could give you a few ideas or suggest a few things that would at least indicate some things that I and other poets have found it useful to do. That is, I could give you some advice. Advice is a real comical thing to give people, right? One becomes a poet so one doesn't have to listen to anybody's advice. Larry Rivers, the painter, and I have been great friends for many, many years. And when we were very young in New York, we used to have these self-congratulatory conversations about why we were artists, and it made us feel real good to think about the fact we really were artists. And the best answer that Larry gave was one day I said, I don't know how many times I asked him, Larry, how come you became a painter? And he said, I wanted to be sitting in my room, and when my mother knocked on the door, I wanted to be able to say, go away, I'm doing something important. And so that in a way, if one's a poet, one doesn't want any advice, but if you come to this class, perhaps I'll start off just by telling you some random things I think are a good idea, a good way for you to spend the next 10 years or 10 days or something. I think it's one of the most important things for a poet to do. Must be Bob Creeley's cigarettes. The most important thing for a poet to do is to read a lot of other poets and to imitate them, steal anything that's good in them. I mean, really read a lot of poetry and be influenced by it. It's not the most important thing, but it's one of the 2 or 3 most important things. Now, some poets have a problem about doing this, and I understand the problem because at certain times in my life I've had the problem. There have been times in my life when I couldn't read a novel because it made me too anxious. I was too envious of the happiness of the characters. And there have been times in my life when I felt I just couldn't imitate other poets. Sometimes I was too envious of other poets to read them, and sometimes I just felt I couldn't imitate them or I'd lose myself. I'd lose my own talent. Your own talent and your own voice is impossible to lose. It's absolutely not possible. If it's possible to lose it, I assure you it doesn't matter. There are a lot of other good things to do in life aside from writing poetry. I mean, there really are. And if you, there's absolutely no way that I can see to be corrupted or to lose your talent unless you have radical brain surgery, or unless really you'd rather be doing something else. I never thought it was a tragedy if somebody said, God, I'm so worried, I'd rather sell cars than write poetry. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with selling cars. Somebody has to sell them, and if you like it, you only live once. Anyway, what was I saying? My God. About reading poetry. Yeah, it's. I don't think it's possible to be original unless you read a tremendous amount and are influenced by lots of people. The idea is arguable, but I'm quite sure it's true. I think you have a chance to be original if you're living out in the mountain somewhere and you never come near a place like this, and you never come near much evidence of contemporary culture. I think you really might find something original without going through the culture. But once you've been here for a week, you're finished. Or once you've practically just gone to the movies and read a few books of poetry, the only path for you to originality, and of course it's a much better path, since there are no people like the first person I described. They don't write poetry usually, because what mainly inspires people to write poetry is not falling in love, but other poetry. And it's if you're not influenced by other poets, you're likely to think you're original when you're really just working on something that Wallace Stevens solved a long time before and got to do terribly well. Why not take the ultimate result of Wallace Stevens? Why not take what Wallace Stevens can do in Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction, or To the One of Fictive Music, or Sunday Morning, or Comedian as the Letter C? Why not just start there? I mean, nobody in science ever thinks of starting back with Newton. It simply doesn't make any sense. I mean, you might as well absorb what the greatest poets have done. It's a little different in science, because in science, it's sort of all there, and there's new equipment. There's a machine that'll do it for you, like the computer's there, and you're certainly not going to go back adding 2 and 2 and all that stuff, because the computer's already there. It's not that way in poetry, because in order to really be able to do what Wallace Stevens can do, you have to read him hard, and probably you have to imitate him. I mean, it's probably the best way to really take into yourself what somebody else can do is to do it with your own body and your own feelings and your own mind. Stevens said in a letter to a friend, this friend wrote to him and said, are you reading a lot? And Stevens wrote back and said, no, I haven't had time to read, but I've been writing a lot of poetry. And writing has always seemed to me a superior form of reading. And it really is for us poets. It's a great way to read. I don't think that poets read the way other people do. I mean, there are certain poets at certain times in my life, I've never been able to read more than 2 pages without running to the typewriter. Because, you can't, if there's something exciting on a page, it's quite natural to want to try it. So that often a very bright person, a very talented person, and a person with genius for writing poetry will not have the same kind of knowledge of a poet's work as a rather mediocre academic person will. Because the poet won't be able to finish the poems, because he'll be writing his own, for one thing, and changing what the other poet did. And for another reason, because the poet will be finding something else in the poetry. Maybe some of you have come to Naropa because you're not doing well in school elsewhere, because you have that funny kind of mind. It's not necessarily bad. I had a lot of trouble with literature in college because, I finally figured it out, but I avoided a lot of courses I should have taken, because what I really wanted to get from poetry was inspiration. I went to Harvard, and I remember I went to the chairman of the English department. He said, well, you're an English major, you should take this course in Milton. And I was stupid at the time. I thought I wouldn't like Milton. I said, I don't think it'll stimulate me. He said, you're not here to be stimulated, Mr. Koch, you're here to be educated. And it seems to me that Naropa is a place where there's a hope, at least, for a kind of education in which stimulation is a part of being educated. But one needs both parts. Anyway, it's very good to read a lot. Probably a good way to begin is to read contemporary poetry. It's the easiest to get. There are all its famous difficulties. Delmore Schwartz, who was my teacher at Harvard, said that it's about as hard to learn to read modern poetry as it is to learn to play bridge. He said he'd found it more rewarding, but then he was a poet and not a bridge player. You really can't lose your own voice, because what happens, this whole stuff about your way of saying things and expressing yourself. In the first place, the you in your poems isn't really you, in my opinion. It is in a way. I believe what Paul Valéry said. He said, a poem is someone by someone who's not the poet, addressed to someone who's not the reader. That is to say, when I'm writing poetry, I can be in France in one line, in Rome in the next, and underground in a copper mine in the next, and I can be speaking 3 different languages at the same time. I can be dreaming and awake. I don't have these powers except when I'm writing. So that also my concerns when I write poetry aren't exactly the same as those I have when I'm not writing. During the Vietnam War, for example, I was very concerned about the war and moderately active against it. I even went to jail once. I never could write a poem about it. I finally did manage to write a poem called The Pleasures of Peace, a long poem. But all the parts about the horrors of the war and the suffering of the people in Vietnam, I couldn't keep them in the poem because they were lousy poetry, or at least they didn't come up to my standards. And so the poem ended up being a poem in praise of peace, which is about as close as I could get. And this didn't have anything to do with, the way I acted when I wasn't writing. So it really is a different person who writes the poems. And I don't think one can entirely choose exactly what that person is going to be like. I think it's worth trying. I mean, I thought it was worth trying to write a very serious political poem, and I'm glad I did it. My relative lack of success is, in a certain way, I like the poem. It's all right. I had that experience. But anyway, I was saying that one has a different voice as a poet at different times. I think it's true, as a number of poets have noticed, that you find a style. Maybe you find a style when you're 25 years old, 27 years old, and you can say anything in it. You're very happy. It's like falling in love. It's great. And you can write a lot of poems. And you try writing the same poem when you're 29 and you can't do it. It's just, you can't use the same style. And there's something about your voice that's changed, about your person that's changed. I mean, one would expect somebody to change in such a sensitive place as the place in which one writes poetry. One would expect that to change. It's absurd to expect a poet to be like a monolith imagine feeling the same way about love now that you did 10 years ago. I mean, you'd be a very funny person. Or even feeling the same way about sleeping or taking a walk. And when you get into these very rarefied things, and poetry is more rarefied than experience, about the associations of words that are connected with your body and with your walking and with your sleeping, they'll probably have changed even more. So I think one should be ready for that kind of change. It's very discouraging. I found it discouraging. I think I found, I found about 4 styles that were my own, completely my own. They weren't like anybody else, really. I was perfectly happy in them. I could say anything I felt in them. And I don't have any of them anymore. I mean, I had some for 2 years. I had some for 4 years. Anyway, what presumably I was talking about was how you should read a lot of poets. You can't lose anything of yourself by being influenced by a poet, no matter how strong he is. All you can do is learn something, how to do it. Just like by imitating the hand movements of great pianists, I presume one could get a kind of knowledge in one's body about which would enable one to play the piano in an original way, because the impulses that would come from one's mind or heart or whatever to the piano would not be the same as Rubinstein's, but your hands would at least be able to do what he could do. Anyway, so after that long parenthesis, the first thing I suggest to everybody who teach writing in Columbia is that they read a lot of modern poetry and be influenced by it. I also think that one has to learn to read the poetry of the past and be influenced by that too. I mean, there are lots of people around who only read modern poetry, and I don't know, that's like just knowing about fashion or something instead of knowing about clothes. There's some modern poets who might not tell you that you have to be able to be influenced by Dante and John Donne and Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe just as much as you're influenced by people around now. They might just forget to tell you that, or they might not want you to be as good as they are. But if they're good poets, they haven't just been influenced by contemporary poetry. Now, the poetry of the past is a little harder. Probably you have to study it. It's one of the good reasons for going to a college. I mean, I think one can really question the whole thing, like why go to school if you want to write poetry? One good reason is to learn how to read the poetry of the past and the fiction of the past. It's a little bit of a problem. There are if you take say a poem by Shelley or Keats, I think there are two ways that you can read it, sort of two extremes. You can read, let's take Ode to the West Wind, which Alan makes everybody read, which begins, I don't know much of it, I don't have any books with me. Oh, wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being. Well, I read that one way when I was 15 years old, and I got something out of it. I got a big rushy feeling about words. I got a feeling that I could talk to nature, and it's pretty good, all that I could say oh, and I could use thou, and I could say things like, so I could say, oh, windows opening, thy breath through which this, and I could do that. But I didn't know what Shelley was talking about. And I didn't really, I couldn't really be Shelley. I couldn't feel the way he did. I could feel the way a modern person does responding to Shelley, which is pretty good. I mean, it kept me going for quite a few years, reading poetry that way. But there's something else you get when you can really hear Hamlet saying, to be or not to be, that is the question. We can hear that as, Jesus, I wonder if I should bump myself off. Because it doesn't sound like that. See, to be or not to be, that is the question. Hamlet is a young guy, a successful guy. I mean, you're Prince, huh? You're Prince in a nice, clean, cold country, and everything is terrific. And except, your father, you think maybe your mother killed your father and everything. And but you're thinking like you're very rich, you have everything. You think, Jesus Christ, I really think I ought to kill myself. But you hear to be or not to be, that is a question. And what that meant to me for years was just, that suggested to me, there's all this patina on it, that stuff you get in old jars. It's Renaissance, nobility of man, the complete man, Hamlet, Shakespeare, Stratford. I never thought of anybody wanting to kill himself when I read that line. It's worth going to school to be able to hear Hamlet saying, I wonder if I should kill myself. And it's not easy, because all the these and nows and the funny words and everything really get in the way. I think you can be quite inspired by just reading it flat, as though it were written yesterday. And I wouldn't say no to that at all, And I wouldn't say there's no point in reading poems in a foreign language you don't understand either. I mean, you read Jadis si je me souviens bien, if you read it Jadis si je me souviens bien, it might make you think about Janice, let's go visit Uncle Ben. And that's a fine line, that's all right. I mean, but you won't be getting that sort of sweet, dark, sexy nostalgia that Rimbaud put in those words. Once, if I remember rightly, my life was my life was a party at which all the wines were flowing. It's really good to be able to read Donne and Shakespeare and all those people as though they were talking to you, as though they were William Carlos Williams or Allen Ginsberg, or Frank O'Hara. So you really hear them in a certain way. Anyway, I suggest that. I suggest also that you learn a foreign language. I don't suppose too many people come to Europa because they want to be told to do a lot of work. But there's no way to be a good poet without doing a lot of work. It's all very pleasant because you keep getting better and better. It's like, you never have to wait. You don't have to wait till you speak French like Paul Claudel to be influenced by learning French. As soon as you pick up a language book and it says, it's raining, it's snowing, the sun is shining, how long have you been in Paris, how long have you been in Madrid, I like France, I hate France, you practically got a poem. I mean, right away when you started, you say like, je suis content, I'm happy. You're thinking about the difference between the word happy and content, and contentment and happiness, and it's inspiring instantly. So it's not, I would never propose to people, I think it's too punishing to say, you've got a lot of work to do in the next 3 years, and then you can write a poem. I've never had students write an exercise in the 20 years I've been teaching. They're always writing poetry. I mean, you don't learn anything from doing exercises, I don't think. You don't learn as much. It's very boring. Like, why don't you all pretend to be friends? And that's all that yucky stuff they do. You know, and touch each other. I mean, that's exercises in affection. I don't think that makes any sense. I think you should really like somebody, or really write a poem. The reason it's great to know a foreign language is that, in the first place, just as with the poetry of the past, then you can read all of these things that would otherwise be completely closed off to you. Also, it gives one a very nice and true sense about words. Like, let's see. This thing here, this isn't really the same as the sound glasses, huh? Nor is it the same as the sound lunette, which it is in French. Little moons, lunette, lune. And let's see, in Italian it's, what is it in Italian?
Spettacolo.
I don't think it is.
That's Spanish.
So spettacoli in Italian is shows. What? Occhiali, that's it. Occhiali, that's the eye. Yeah, and it sort of gives you this nice free space feeling about language that you really realize in a good way that words aren't the same as things. They're sort of floating around and you attach them to things, and it was very inspiring to me. Just even in the first stages of my learning French, I remember when I learned the word. Also, you learn a lot about what words mean. It's very interesting. I remember when I first said the word in French, appartement, which is the word for apartment. I never knew where that word came from. But as soon as it was separated by that little it's a way to live to keep people apart. You know, appartement, there's this part, and there's this part of your apart. I was very astonished also by désastre, which is the French word for disaster. Astre means planets, and de means from. Disaster is something that's, you know, boom, lightning strikes you. But it's also nice, just, it gives one a nice feeling for the sound of words. And it's terrific because it enables you to do translations. And translations are one of the best things in the world to do when you're feeling uninspired, when you're feeling dry, and you feel you can't say anything, or you're stuck on some subject. Translations are really good because you realize when you're doing translations that what poetry is all about is language. And just as what sculpture is all about is stone or clay, and music is all about sound. I mean, you can make meanings with language, but I mean, it's language. And translation always reminds one of that, and it's something one can do when one is not particularly inspired. One gets very involved in it. Another nice thing about translation is you know how you're influenced and inspired by the poems you've written yourself, how like some line that you've written in another poem will come back in another form or in the same form, and you feel really inspired and use it in a better way. Well, say if you translate a poem by Rimbaud or Baudelaire, say, or Pasternak or anybody, if you work hard on it, it becomes one of your poems as far as your unconscious is concerned, and it becomes part of what you've done. It becomes part of what's liable to happen when you write. So it's a really dramatic, deep way of being influenced is to translate. Let's see, what have I recommended? Reading a lot of modern poetry and being influenced by it. Studying the poetry of the past and being influenced by that, and learning a foreign language. It's very good to have a couple friends who are really good poets, who are good enough to make you envious, and who know what you're doing. And I found that the most valuable thing in my life as a poet, that I was friends with John Ashbery and Frank O'Hara. I didn't need, when I was in my 20s, I didn't need to be published. I would have liked it. I wasn't, though. I didn't need to be published. I didn't need to be applauded at readings. I didn't give any reading. I didn't need many readers. I think I had about 20. I needed something. I mean, John and Frank were worth, they were worth more than 100,000 readers each. One needs one needs people to make the world of writing poetry real for you and to keep you going. I don't think it's good to be the only poet in a little town where everybody admires you and thinks you're great because you're a poet and lets you get drunk and you give radio programs and you write for the newspaper and you get to make out with everybody. It doesn't do your poetry any good. It sounds like sort of a happy life, but it's not good for your poetry because there's no competition. Competition's really good. I recommend places where there are a lot of good poets. New York's an awful place to live, but it's a great place to be a poet. It used to be anyway. I presume it still is. I still live there. But I think I'm already formed. It's annoying to know other good poets, but I really do recommend it. Let's see. Oh, I think it's a good idea to write a lot. Really write a lot. Many young poets are working very hard on one or two little things. And I think if you haven't, I think it's good to try a lot of different things. I think, among these things, different ways of revising, which I'll talk about in a minute, because that's kind of interesting. It's a problem to make revision as interesting as the first time, but it can be done. It can make it easier for you to try lots of different kinds of writing. If you can find a good poetry teacher. I see one function of my poetry workshops, which I teach at Columbia, as making it easier for people to try things they're not good at. People who aren't writers don't know how humiliating it is to write something that's bad and stupid and clumsy, even though nobody ever sees it. But anybody who's a poet knows how awful it makes you feel. It's like, it's like failing in a conversation or in love or something. It's just awful, even if nobody knows about it. And if you get pretty good at writing ironic poems about the city in free verse, that you write that's a good one of yours, Kenny. And somebody says, why don't you try writing, why don't you write a couple sestinas or why don't you write a poem with a city and an item of clothing and a color in every line? I say, well, that would be stupid. But in a class, it's easier to do that. Because everybody's doing it. You don't risk any humiliation. The teacher doesn't expect a masterpiece. So you can try things you wouldn't otherwise do. So I imagine you can find some pretty good writing teachers around here at various times. Different writing teachers would be good for different people. I don't think it's a good idea to spend your life in a writing workshop, incidentally. There are people who get a heavy dependence. I think it's all right to try a couple, but I'd suggest taking a year off after you have a good one, It's wonderful if you can find a good teacher of literature. If you can find somebody who can teach romantic poetry, so it's really alive and it's connected to things you care about, you're so lucky. But even if you find somebody who just respects the literature but isn't quite as alive as you are, it's all right. At least you'll get to read the work and you won't be forced to have a lot of bad ideas. I think as a poet, in being a poet and a student, one learns, or one has to know how to defend oneself a little bit against academic types. And I'll talk about that a little bit. Most people I know, not people I associate with, but I travel a lot because I did this stuff teaching kids to write poetry, and I meet a lot of teachers and all kinds of people who never read poetry. Most people in the United States, so far as I know, either dislike or are indifferent to it. A lot of them even hate poetry. And the reason they do is, and these are people, not stupid people, they're people who wouldn't think their life was really worthwhile unless they went to concerts sometimes, unless they went to good movies, unless they went to the opera if it came to town, unless they traveled, and went to Europe, unless they saw good paintings. But you talk to them about poetry and they say, oh, poetry, I don't know, I don't get it, I guess I'm just, and you look at them, it's like somebody who says, I don't know, I see a lot of things, I see a lot of things, my nose, I'm smelling things. You're missing a lot, And it's very hard to convince them of this, and here's why they don't like it. I think it's fairly simple. The way most people that I know were taught poetry in high school and college is briefly this. A poem is something created by a very clever sadist who hides who hides a symbol in a lot of onomatopoeia and alliteration and all that stuff. So the point of reading a poem is you pick up a poem and you're supposed to find what it really means. So somebody says, I'm going to take a walk today. Is it Christ? It can't be a guy just taking a walk. So you've got to find what it really means. So a poem, it doesn't mean what's there. I mean, the whole idea of what language means in general is too much for me. I can't even do it today. Let's assume it means something. But at least let's assume if a guy says, I'm going to take a walk, it doesn't mean Golgotha. All right. I mean, unless psychosis is going to take over completely. All right. So you look at the poem and you say, you're a kid, you're in high school, you say, the poet says he's going to take a walk, the teacher says. Really read that line. Come on. If he's meaning something stupid, And so you read it, and Jesus. And even if you find the secret meaning, you won't know it as well as the teacher. That's why teachers, it's part of the teaching industry to teach this way, because you really know something. It got to be very important when all the money was going for science, so we get ahead of the Russians. The English teacher said, well, what am I doing? But if you know the symbol and nobody else does, then they need you. It's real hard. It's really worthwhile work to be an English teacher. And even the poor teacher, though, can't know it as well as the poet, who must be pictured as some insane sadist sitting in a tower, chuckling over this poem that nobody will ever enjoy or understand. Now, since you've all written poems, you know that that's not the way poets feel. And you should never let anybody tell you that. It's utterly stupid. And I don't know how this industry got started. It's like, but then, thinking about McDonald's and stuff. You can't tell what's going to really catch on. But that something like that should catch on in the intellectual world is very strange. But I would say that 99% of professors probably teach poetry wrong. They've probably been too influenced by this. Not 99%, that's silly, because I don't know enough of them. I hate to generalize, especially for the tape recorder. But an awful lot of teachers that I have known and listened to make that mistake, thinking. So this means that when people graduate from school, they pick up a book of poems. It's an unpleasant experience. It's kind of humiliating. You pick up a poem and you say, oh gosh, I'm probably not getting it. And you feel humiliated. Well, you're making $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year. Your kids love you. You're an attractive man or woman, and you go to the movies and you like to smoke and drink. And why should you be humiliated? Why should you pick up one of these awful pills? And so you don't read poetry. And that's what happens to almost everybody. It's like being invited to a party when you don't have any nice clothes. You can't understand the poem. So everybody hates poetry. So one does what one can, to do something about that. I wrote a couple books about how to teach poetry to little kids and stuff, but it's done a little bit of good. There are other reasons why people look for deep meanings in poetry. And that's because, it's perfectly natural to do it. It just, you have to control the process. You can't teach poetry so that all that's there is the deep meanings. Graduate students come to me at Columbia, sometimes they want me to help them work on their dissertation. What are you writing about? The deep meaning of Joseph Conrad's novel. I say no. They say, why not? I say, because the deep meaning of Joseph Conrad is the same as the deep meaning of every other writer who's ever lived. There are about 5 deep meanings, which I will now tell you. Life is not worth living. Life seems not worth living, but is worth living after all. There are very few deep meanings. I said, why don't you read some of Conrad's letters and read a couple of his novels and think about the difference between his epistolary style and his novel writing style. I'd love to know about that. It's very interesting, the different way people write letters and write novels. They say, that's not deep enough. But anyway, it's quite I'm getting a little bit off the subject. The reason it's natural to find deep meanings in poetry. And the reason this whole critical and professorial mistake started, I think, is this. That almost, the intention of almost all language is either to just keep life moving along in a jolly way, just instead of like rubbing and touching and stuff. You say, how you doing? Oh, I'm great, that's great, that's terrific, great, let's come over, you son of a bitch. I mean, that all, it's just, there's that stuff, pushing and touching. Then an awful lot of it is to give information. How do you get to the ladies' room? You go down the hall, turn to the left. Paul Valéry said the function of prose is to perish. That is, you find out how to get to the ladies' room. You don't go through life with these words ringing in your head, down the hall and turn to the left. Poetry is different because the words would be said, arranged in a certain way so that they would stay in your head, and the meaning would not be so precise. Poetry is a very strange kind of communication. It's a very strange way of using language, which looks like the regular way of Fairview Barton Financial put on an 11th hour rally Saturday night to score a narrow 6-5 victory over Colorado Springs. Michelle Realty. Hey, the schools have long names here. Over Colorado Springs, Michelle Realty at Scott Carpenter Park. Now, the intention of that is to give information. And poetry looks like that, but it's not quite like that. Sort of like Fairview put on, Fairview put on an 11th hour Saturday night dress to score a narrow Colorado Springs at Scott's Reality. And it deliberately distorts the ordinary use of language so that it invites dreaming. It sort of opens up a fissure like an earthquake. It opens up something so that all of this rich material one's not conscious of, except in dreams, and sometimes under the influence of certain stupefying things, and sometimes at moments of great passion, one is usually not aware of all of these things that one has seen, forgotten. Like at this moment, I'm not talking about Freud's idea of the subconscious as painful things that are repressed, but at this moment, some part of me for some time has been looking at the gleaming of what seems to be a car and what seems to be a plastic box with slats up there. In back of it is a breast-like green mountain part, and there are Venetian blinds which remind me of newsprint, and I'm aware of about 25 of your faces in this room. I've had random thoughts about all of you. All this will be gone in an hour. Unless one of you becomes my friend, or unless I go live on that mountain or buy that car, But this is happening constantly. And all of this stuff is there somewhere. And one is in possession of a tremendous amount of information, of sensation. And it's like all those keys on the piano. If you have all of these things to compare things to, like all these connections, degrees of consciousness of all different kinds of things, you're much more likely to be able to write something powerful and beautiful and new. And poetry sort of deliberately distorts language so that these other associations can appear, so that one can dream, so that one can see in a more powerful way than one ordinarily does. Therefore, since poetry is so rare, since almost all of what we read is not poetry, but has this other intention, it's quite natural if you read a poem and the poet says, the tree against the window, afternoon, which is not an ordinary prose, but is understandable enough. That properly makes one think of more trees, more windows, and more afternoons, and more weather, more light, than the statement would be. I found it of interest to regard the tree through the window in the afternoon, which makes it just the experience of the person who's talking. It doesn't give you any chance to associate with it. But so, since poetry is so odd in being not information-giving, not direct in that way, it's quite natural to want to find all kinds of deep meanings in it, because one is going around with all of these deep meanings which need to find a text. I may generalize and say that we don't know why we're alive. We don't know anything about death. We don't understand beauty. We don't understand love. We don't understand passion. We understand almost nothing. And yet we care passionately about all these things that not only we do not understand, but which modern philosophy has shown us are not real questions. That doesn't matter to people emotionally at all. We go around with this great mystery. As Walt Whitman says, I and this mystery, here we stand. And the mystery is always looking for a text. It's looking for a statue, it's looking for a painting, it's looking for some music, it's looking for a poem, it's looking for some words so that it can say, that's me, that's it, that's the answer, that's it. And I think it's particularly true when one is in one's late teens and 20s, that the mystery is almost overwhelming because it hasn't been used much. It hasn't been used much in one's life yet. It's just, and so it's very, very natural for people in college of that age to look for all kinds of mysteries in poetry. I think it doesn't do you any good to read all poems as though they're the same poem, though. To find the same mystery in Corinna's Going A-Maying as you find in The Wasteland. I mean, then you might as well just read one poem all the time. In any case, that was a big parenthesis, but it's something I wanted to say anyway. Resist your professors a little and read poetry. Get what's good, and you don't have to get mad at them if they say, this really means something else. Just read it for yourself. I teach this modern poetry course at Columbia, and I used to teach a lot of poets and a lot of poems and tell a lot of things about them. And I found recently the main thing I have to teach my students is they don't know how to read a poem. It's really valuable to know how to read a poem because then you can read all poems. And then you can be in touch with all these terrific things. And I had to recognize too that a lot of poetry is really hard to understand. I mean, I don't know anybody who hasn't studied a lot who can pick up a poem by Yeats and understand it. And it's real stupid of a professor to think you ought to understand a Yeats poem, even an early one, without reading it about 3 times and thinking about it. They're worth understanding. So I read, I found something interesting that I think is true. I told my students, I read them a poem, say by Yeats, and have them read it, and I say, just tell me anything you like about this poem, because pleasure is the first sign of understanding. If that seems an odd idea, think of the analogy of music. If you're listening to a Mozart quintet, say, if you don't get any pleasure from it, you're never going to understand it, because the thing is put together to cause pleasure. That's what it's all about. If you, it's a construction of pleasure. Art sort of really teaches through pleasure, or gives experience through pleasure. That's why a work of art can't really be ugly in the ordinary sense. It can use things that are ordinarily thought to be ugly so that they're beautiful. I mean, you can take a wrecked car and arrange the parts of it so it's beautiful, or you can, you can take things that are even uglier than that. But the end result, there's a kind of shock art where you just want to make a comment on art, and you bring in a big pile of, you bring a horse into an art gallery and he defecates and you walk the horse out and that's the opening. And that it's not really art, but a comment on the history of art, I would say. Anyway, where am I? Larry, what was I talking about?
I don't know.
You're too good a listener.
What about painting, sculpture, ballet, all of that?
Oh yeah, wait, yeah.
Teaching it in your class.
Oh, teaching it, yeah. So I said that pleasure is the first sign of understanding. If you've ever had to suffer through a course in college, you're probably glad to hear that. It's true. Like, you listen to a Yeats poem, and I say, just tell me anything you like. It's impossible to understand this poem the first time you hear it. So people say brilliant things if you make them believe that's true. Some guy said, I like the way this poet sounds so convinced that what he's saying is important. That's one of the great things about Yeats. Has there ever been anybody who read a poet for the content of his poetry? I mean, what is all this stuff about meaning? I think the meaning, it's important to know the meaning, finally. Sure it is. But that's not why anybody reads Yeats. His ideas are ridiculous. I mean, do you believe, like the poem I read was The Rose of the World. It begins, it's a beautiful poem. Who dreams that beauty passes like a dream? Who dreams that beauty passes like a dream? For these red lips with all their mournful pride, mournful that no new wonder may become. He wrote a while ago. Mournful that no new wonder may be tied. Troy passed away in one high funeral gleam, and Ushna's children died. Ushna's children are, who's that guy who was in love with Deirdre, that Concubar killed? Nisi, it's spelled Nisi, it's somebody in Celtic mythology. Anyway, obviously you don't read that. You're not interested in that poem because you really believe that there was a spirit of beauty in the form of a woman who stood beside God's throne at the creation. I mean, what an idea. It's sort of interesting, nice, like the idea that there's a huge white pig in the sky who makes all the clouds. But I mean, anyway, one of the reasons you read Yeats is because he sounds as though what he's saying is so damned important. There's that wonderful tone of urgency. It's why I like to look at some of Picasso's paintings too. I like to listen to certain composers. I mean, it's terrific. It was a brilliant comment. I think that's great. And eventually we went on with everybody just saying what they liked, and eventually we understood the poem. It's a good way to do it. Okay, enough about the teaching. Let's see. That's a lot of advice I gave you now. Let's see. Reading a lot of poetry, past and present, learning another language, translating, finding some good teachers, trying a lot of things in your writing a lot. I've probably forgotten a lot of things, but we have another class. I've been talking too much about myself as a teacher. I should maybe talk about my experiences as a writer, which I've been doing in the parentheses. But that always seems sort of arrogant to me unless you ask me questions about it. In fact, why don't you ask me some questions about anything? Yeah.
When you write, do you get edited really heavily, like when you get published?
I've never allowed anybody to edit me at all. People don't edit poetry. I mean, if they do, they're loco. I mean, it depends. Say if John Ashbery were editing a magazine and I sent in a poem and he'd say, Kenneth, I like this. I don't think the last stanza is as good as the rest. I might try to rewrite the poem. But as Ezra Pound says, I mean, there's not too much point in paying attention to somebody who hasn't written really good poetry. I mean, Pound says there's no point paying any attention to anybody who hasn't written a masterpiece. Masterpiece is a rather heavy word. I've gotten so in my middle years that I can find advice from all kinds of people useful. I used to be so scared and anxious so defensive that I found criticism very hard to take. Now I can take it from almost anybody. It's a great pleasure. It's an advantage of growing older in my case. What would you like me to talk about, or what would you like to know about? Yeah.
I'm trying to collect exactly what I'd like to ask, but one of the things I'd like to ask is specifically how a sense of voice arose in possibly in the early 50s. I thought that's when Frank O'Hara was starting to write his poems.
A sense of voice?
Frank O'Hara yourself, and some of the other, was it Bergson? Bill Bergson or something. And a group of people that were associated around New York, like Larry, to reiterate what Larry said around the sense of the art world in New York, whereas at the same time, a circle of friends, Alan and Jack and Greg and those people more or less went to the West Coast to deal with the Pacific and Japan and stuff, and Buddhism. Because in other words, like now poetry is so kind of stultified that the new poets who are developing their voices are understanding the history as an enormous accumulation of time. It's kind of like opening up right now. younger poets, and finding maybe if you can have a spark or sense of that crystal or what arose that differed.
What happened in the
At that
50s?
point, with a sense of tone and voice and manifestos, or just a sense of collected energy of understanding. That
Alan will have to tell you about what happened. What?
One could dig on what the aesthetics that the visual artists were doing and interpret that as a statement for the phenomena of reality or time for the person associated.
Alan will have to tell you what was going on in his head.
Well, I wasn't talking specifically
And